It was a day that started like any other, but it would end in a way no one could have imagined. On May 25, 2020, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a black man named George Floyd went to a grocery store to buy cigarettes. He didn't know it then, but this simple trip would lead to his name being spoken across the world. George Floyd was 46 years old, a father, and someone who had dreams just like anyone else. But on this day, something terrible happened. Something so shocking that it made people everywhere stop and ask themselves if justice truly existed. The trouble began when an employee at Cup Foods, the corner store where George had stopped, called the police. They claimed he had tried to use a fake $20 bill. When officers arrived, they approached George, who was sitting in his car outside the store. Things quickly turned bad. The police asked him to step out of the vehicle, and soon after, a struggle broke out. What followed next became the focus of headlines worldwide. One of the officers involved was Derek Chauvin, a white man with nearly 2 decades of experience as a cop. To many, he looked like someone who should be trusted, a figure of authority, meant to protect and serve. But what unfolded over the next few minutes shattered that image forever. After handcuffing George Floyd and pinning him face down on the ground, Chauvin did something unthinkable. He pressed his knee onto George's neck, pressing down hard enough to cut off his breathing. George begged for mercy. "I can't breathe," he said repeatedly, his voice growing weaker with each passing second. Bystanders watched in horror, some recording the scene on their phones. Mothers held their children close, shielding them from the sight while others screamed at the officers to stop. One woman, Darnella Frazier, captured the entire incident on video. Her hands shook as she filmed, her voice pleading with the officers to let George go. But they didn't listen. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, Derek Chauvin kept his knee firmly planted on George Floyd's neck. Even when George fell silent, even when he stopped moving, the pressure didn't ease. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. George Floyd was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. His life was gone, and nothing could bring him back. The video shot by Darnella Frazier spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere, in homes, on phones, and across social media platforms. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. How could this happen? Why didn't anyone intervene? The footage showed not only Chauvin's actions, but also 3 other officers standing by doing nothing to help George. It was a moment that left viewers angry, heartbroken, and scared. As news of George Floyd's death spread, protests erupted in Minneapolis. At first, they were small gatherings near the spot where he died. But soon more and more people joined in, people of all ages, races, and backgrounds. They carried signs that read, "Black Lives Matter," and chanted slogans demanding justice. The anger wasn't just about George Floyd. It was about every person who had been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. It was about Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and countless others whose lives had been cut short under similar circumstances. By the next day, the protests grew larger and louder. In cities across America, people took to the streets. Some marched peacefully, holding candles and singing songs. Others expressed their frustration more forcefully, breaking windows and setting fires. Police responded with tear gas and rubber bullets, escalating tensions even further. Television screens filled with images of chaos, but behind every act of destruction was pain, a deep, overwhelming sense of injustice that had been building for years. Meanwhile, Derek Chauvin and the 3 other officers involved in George Floyd's arrest were fired from the police department. Many hoped this would be the first step toward accountability, but others knew firing them wasn't enough. They wanted criminal charges, real consequences for what had happened. Lawyers worked tirelessly to build a case against the officers, gathering evidence and talking to witnesses. Every detail mattered because this wasn't just about one man or one city. It was about sending a message to the entire country. Back in Minneapolis, George Floyd's family struggled to come to terms with their loss. His brother, Philanise, spoke publicly, sharing memories of George as a kind and loving person. "He was my big brother," Philanise said, tears streaming down his face. "He didn't deserve this." Their grief resonated with families around the world who had lost loved ones to police violence. For them, George Floyd's story wasn't new. It was painfully familiar. As days passed, the protests continued to grow. What started as a local outcry became a global movement. Thousands marched in London, Paris, Toronto, and Sydney, carrying banners with George Floyd's name. Social media played a huge role, amplifying voices that might otherwise have gone unheard. Hashtags like Black Lives Matter trended for weeks, drawing attention to issues of racism and inequality. Celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens added their voices to the chorus calling for change. But amidst the rallies and hashtags, questions lingered. Would anything actually change? Or would this just be another tragic chapter in a long history of injustice? People waited anxiously for answers, hoping that George Floyd's death wouldn't be in vain. Little did they know, the events of that fateful day were only the beginning of a much larger fight, one that would test the strength of communities, challenge institutions, and redefine what justice means in modern society. And so, as the world mourned the loss of George Floyd, it also prepared itself for the battles ahead. His death had sparked a fire fueled by hope, determination, and an unshakable belief that things could get better. Whether or not that hope would translate into action remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: George Floyd's name would never be forgotten. As the video of George Floyd's death spread across social media, it became impossible to ignore. The footage, captured by Darnella Frazier, showed Derek Chauvin kneeling on George's neck for over 9 minutes while he pleaded for his life. People around the world watched in disbelief as George gasped for air, repeating, "I can't breathe," until his voice faded into silence. The chilling images were hard to look at, but they were even harder to turn away from. For many, this wasn't just another news story. It was a raw and painful reminder of the deep-seated racism and police brutality that had plagued America for generations. The video went viral almost instantly. Within hours, millions of people had seen it. Families gathered around their phones and televisions, unable to tear their eyes away from the screen. Some cried openly, overwhelmed by the injustice of what they were witnessing. Others felt anger bubbling inside them. Anger not just at Derek Chauvin, but at a system that seemed to allow such things to happen again and again. Social media platforms lit up with posts sharing the video, along with messages of grief, outrage, and calls for change. Hashtags like Justice for George Floyd and Black Lives Matter trended worldwide, uniting people under a common cause. In Minneapolis, where the incident occurred, protests erupted almost immediately. Hundreds of people poured into the streets nearby the spot where George Floyd had died. They held signs bearing messages like "Stop killing us" and "No justice, no peace." Some chanted his name, while others sang spiritual songs or prayed together. The atmosphere was tense but determined. Many protesters carried flowers or candles, creating makeshift memorials to honor George's memory. It was clear that this wasn't just about one man. It was about all the lives lost to systemic racism and unchecked power. As the days passed, the protests grew larger and more widespread. What started as a local outcry quickly turned into a national movement. In cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Atlanta, thousands of people took to the streets. Marches filled highways, blocked bridges, and surrounded government buildings. Protesters came from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, rich and poor. Despite their differences, they shared a common goal: demanding justice for George Floyd and an end to police violence against black communities. But not everyone protested peacefully. In some places, frustration boiled over into clashes with police. Windows were smashed, stores were looted, and fires burned through the night. Police responded with force, using tear gas, rubber bullets, and batons to disperse crowds. Television screens showed chaotic scenes of officers clashing with demonstrators, adding fuel to the fire. Critics argued that the aggressive tactics used by law enforcement only proved the protesters' point, that policing in America needed drastic reform. Amidst the chaos, voices of leadership began to emerge. Civil rights activists like Reverend Al Sharpton called for calm while urging people to keep fighting for justice. Politicians weighed in too, though their responses varied widely. Some condemned the killing outright, calling for accountability and reform. Others downplayed the incident, suggesting that George Floyd's death was an isolated event rather than part of a broader pattern. Meanwhile, celebrities and public figures joined the conversation, using their platforms to amplify the message of the protests. Athletes kneeled during games, musicians released tribute songs, and actors donated money to organizations working toward racial equality. While much of the focus remained on Derek Chauvin, attention also shifted to the three other officers present during George Floyd's arrest. Their names were Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Kueng, and Tu Thao. Though none of them had placed their knees on George's neck, they stood by and did nothing to stop Chauvin. To many, their inaction was just as damning. How could trained professionals stand idly by while a man begged for his life? The question haunted those who followed the case closely. Behind the scenes, lawyers worked tirelessly to build a case against the officers. Investigators combed through every detail of the incident, reviewing body camera footage, witness statements, and medical reports. Experts analyzed how long George Floyd had been deprived of oxygen and whether his pre-existing health conditions played a role in his death. Each piece of evidence brought them closer to answering the most pressing question. Could Derek Chauvin and the others be held accountable? Public pressure mounted as the days turned into weeks. People demanded answers and action. Calls for justice weren't limited to holding the officers responsible. They extended to addressing the root causes of police brutality. Activists pushed for reforms such as banning chokeholds, requiring body cameras, and establishing independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct. Some cities went further, proposing cuts to police budgets and reallocating funds to community programs aimed at reducing crime and improving relations between law enforcement and citizens. Despite the growing momentum, there were moments of doubt. Skeptics wondered if anything would really change. After all, history was filled with examples of similar tragedies followed by empty promises. Would George Floyd's death lead to meaningful progress, or would it fade into the background like so many cases before it? These questions weighed heavily on the minds of protesters and advocates alike. Still, hope persisted. Around the globe, people rallied behind the Black Lives Matter movement, showing solidarity with those fighting for justice in America. In London, thousands marched through the streets, carrying signs that read, "The UK is not innocent," highlighting cases of police violence in their own country. In Paris, demonstrators gathered outside the U.S. Embassy, chanting slogans and lighting candles in memory of George Floyd. Even in countries with no direct connection to the events in Minneapolis, people found ways to express their support. From Sydney to Johannesburg, the message was clear. Enough was enough. Back in Minneapolis, George Floyd's family tried to navigate their grief amid the whirlwind of attention. His brother Philanese spoke at rallies, sharing stories about George's kindness and humor. His sister Bridget addressed lawmakers, urging them to take action. Their pain was palpable, but so was their determination. They wanted justice, not just for George, but for everyone who had suffered because of systemic racism. By the time Derek Chauvin and the other officers were arrested, the protests had reached a fever pitch. Charges ranged from second-degree murder to aiding and abetting manslaughter, depending on each officer's role in the incident. While some saw the arrests as a step in the right direction, others cautioned that true justice wouldn't come until the trial concluded. Until then, the nation and the world would wait anxiously, watching to see if accountability would finally prevail. Through it all, George Floyd's name continued to echo across continents. His death had sparked something powerful, a collective awakening to the realities of racial inequality and police brutality. As the protests raged on, one thing became abundantly clear. This was more than just a moment. It was a movement. And, though the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, the people marching in the streets refused to give up. For them, George Floyd's legacy was worth fighting for. Months after George Floyd's death, The courtroom in downtown Minneapolis became the center of attention. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a moment that felt like history in the making. The trial of Derek Chauvin, the former police officer accused of killing George Floyd, began under intense scrutiny. People from all over the world tuned in to watch the proceedings, hoping for answers and accountability. Would justice finally be served? Or would this case end like so many others, with disappointment and frustration? The courtroom itself was packed with lawyers, jurors, witnesses, and members of the media. Cameras rolled as reporters prepared to broadcast every detail to millions of viewers. Outside, protesters gathered daily, holding signs and chanting slogans like, "Say his name," George Floyd. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. For many, this trial represented more than just one man's fate. It symbolized the possibility of change, a chance to hold law enforcement accountable for their actions. Derek Chauvin sat quietly at the defense table, dressed in a suit instead of his old police uniform. His face showed little emotion, even as prosecutors laid out their case against him. They argued that Chauvin had acted recklessly and cruelly when he knelt on George Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes. To support their claims, they called a long list of witnesses, people who had been there that day, experts who could explain what happened medically, and even fellow police officers who believed Chauvin had violated protocol. One of the first witnesses was Darnella Frazier, the teenage girl who had filmed the now famous video of George Floyd's death. Her voice trembled as she recounted the events of that tragic afternoon. She described how she had walked to the store with her cousin when she saw George lying on the ground, handcuffed and struggling to breathe. "I didn't know what to do," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted them to stop hurting him." Her testimony reminded everyone of the humanity behind the headlines, the fact that an ordinary teenager had captured something extraordinary and unimaginable. Other bystanders followed, each sharing their perspective. Some were angry, recalling how they had begged the officers to let George go. Others were heartbroken, describing how they had prayed or cried as they watched him take his last breaths. One particularly emotional witness was Charles McMillian, a man who had tried to intervene during the arrest. He broke down on the stand, saying, "I told him George to comply because I thought it would save his life. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered." Medical experts also played a crucial role in the trial. Doctors testified about how prolonged pressure on George Floyd's neck and back had restricted blood flow and oxygen, ultimately leading to his death. They explained that even though George had underlying health conditions, those issues alone wouldn't have caused his sudden collapse. Instead, they pointed to the clear link between Chauvin's actions and the fatal outcome. Their testimony painted a chilling picture of how easily a human life could be taken, and how preventable George Floyd's death truly was. Perhaps the most surprising witnesses were the current and former police officers who spoke out against Derek Chauvin. In a rare move, several members of law enforcement took the stand to condemn their former colleagues' behavior. Minneapolis Police Chief Madaria Arredondo stated bluntly that Chauvin had violated department policies and failed to uphold the values of policing. "We are here to protect and serve," he said firmly. "What we saw in that video is not acceptable." Another officer, Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman, echoed this sentiment, calling Chauvin's actions totally unnecessary and completely contrary to training. On the other hand, Chauvin's defense team worked hard to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that George Floyd's death was complicated and couldn't be blamed solely on Chauvin's knee. Instead, they suggested that his pre-existing health problems, such as heart disease and drug use, had contributed significantly to his passing. They presented expert witnesses who supported this theory, attempting to shift focus away from Chauvin's conduct. Defense attorneys also highlighted moments from the bystander videos where George appeared to resist arrest, implying that his own actions may have escalated the situation. Throughout the trial, tensions ran high both inside and outside the courtroom. Jurors listened carefully, knowing the weight of their decision. Each piece of evidence, each word spoken by the witnesses, carried immense significance. For weeks, They absorbed testimony after testimony, piecing together what had happened on that fateful day. Meanwhile, protests continued outside, with demonstrators urging the jury to deliver a verdict that reflected justice. As closing arguments approached, emotions reached a boiling point. Prosecutors delivered passionate speeches, reminding the jury of George Floyd's humanity and the responsibility of police officers to act with care and restraint. They emphasized that Chauvin's actions went far beyond reasonable force and amounted to murder. "This case is about accountability," one prosecutor declared. "It's about ensuring that no one is above the law, not even a police officer." In contrast, Chauvin's defense team urged caution. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof rested entirely on the prosecution. Without definitive evidence proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Chauvin had intentionally killed George Floyd, they argued he should be acquitted. Their tone was calm but firm, aiming to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the jurors. When the final arguments concluded, the courtroom fell silent. It was time for the jury to deliberate, a process that felt agonizingly slow to those waiting anxiously for a verdict. Protesters camped outside the courthouse, lighting candles and holding vigils. Families gathered around televisions, praying for justice. Social media buzzed with speculation, hashtags, and messages of hope. Everyone knew that whatever decision the jury reached would send shockwaves across the nation, and possibly the world. For nearly 3 weeks, the trial had exposed painful truths about policing, racism, and accountability. Witnesses had shared their stories, experts had explained the science, and lawyers had debated the finer points of the law. Now, it was up to 12 people to decide Derek Chauvin's fate, and in doing so, determine whether justice would prevail for George Floyd. The wait was excruciating. Every hour felt like an eternity. Yet despite the uncertainty, one thing remained clear. George Floyd's death had sparked a movement that refused to fade quietly into history. Whether the verdict brought closure or further outrage, his legacy would endure, as a symbol of resilience, a call to action, and a reminder that change often begins with tragedy. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotional pleas, the jury reached a verdict in Derek Chauvin's trial. The courtroom was tense as Judge Peter Cahill read the decision aloud. Millions of people around the world held their breath, glued to their screens, hoping that justice would be served. When the judge announced that Derek Chauvin was guilty on all counts, second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter, the room erupted with gasps and tears. Outside the courthouse, cheers filled the air as protesters celebrated what many saw as a rare but long overdue victory. For George Floyd's family, the verdict brought mixed emotions. Relief washed over them, knowing that the man who had killed their loved one would face consequences. But it also reminded them of the pain they had endured since losing George. His brother Philanese spoke to reporters afterward, his voice breaking, as he said, "Today we got some justice for George, but this doesn't bring him back." It was a bittersweet moment, a step forward but far from true closure. The sentencing hearing came weeks later, giving both sides an opportunity to present victim impact statements. Family members and friends of George Floyd stood before the court, sharing memories of the man they had loved. They described George not just as a victim, but as a father, a brother, a friend, and a source of laughter and joy. His daughter Gianna, only 6 years old, appeared in a video message saying simply, "Daddy changed the world." Her words struck a chord with everyone watching, highlighting how deeply personal this tragedy was, and yet how universal its impact had become. Prosecutors argued for a harsh sentence, emphasizing the severity of Chauvin's actions and the need to send a strong message about accountability. They pointed out that Chauvin hadn't shown any remorse during the trial and had acted with reckless disregard for human life. On the other hand, Chauvin's defense team asked for leniency, claiming that he had already suffered enough through public humiliation and imprisonment. They argued that his decades of service as a police officer should count for something, even though those same years had ended in disgrace. During the hearing, Judge Peter Cahill acknowledged the weight of the case. He recognized that this wasn't just about one man or one incident. It was about addressing systemic issues within policing and society. In the end, he sentenced Derek Chauvin to 22.5 years in prison, marking one of the longest sentences ever handed down to a police officer in the United States for killing a civilian. While some felt the punishment didn't fully match the crime, others saw it as a landmark moment, a sign that change might finally be possible. News of the sentence spread quickly, sparking reactions across the globe. For many, it represented hope, a small glimmer of progress in the fight against racial injustice. Social media lit up with messages celebrating the verdict while urging continued efforts toward reform. Protesters outside the courthouse hugged, cried, and sang songs of gratitude. Some released balloons into the sky, carrying signs with George Floyd's name written on them. It was a powerful reminder that his death had ignited something extraordinary, a movement driven by ordinary people demanding better, but not everyone agreed with the outcome. Critics argued that focusing solely on Chauvin let the system off the hook. They pointed out that 3 other officers involved in George Floyd's arrest, Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Quang, and Tu Thao, had yet to face trial. Others questioned whether punishing one bad actor would truly address the deeper problems plaguing law enforcement. Police unions pushed back against calls for widespread reform, warning that drastic changes could make officers' jobs more dangerous. The debate raged on, reflecting the complexity of the issue. Back in Minneapolis, George Floyd Square, the intersection where he had died, remained a site of pilgrimage. Murals honoring his memory covered nearby walls, surrounded by flowers, candles, and heartfelt notes left by visitors. People came from near and far to pay their respects, turning the space into a living memorial. Each day, volunteers cleaned up the area, ensuring it remained a place of reflection and solidarity. For many, it symbolized resilience, a testament to the power of community when united by a common cause. As news outlets analyzed the verdict, experts weighed in on its implications. Legal scholars noted that convictions like this were exceedingly rare, making Chauvin's guilty verdict stand out. Activists praised the decision, but stressed that real change required more than holding individuals accountable. They called for systemic reforms, including stricter oversight of police departments, mandatory de-escalation training, and investments in marginalized communities. Politicians responded cautiously, promising to take action while avoiding bold commitments that might alienate voters. Meanwhile, George Floyd's family worked tirelessly to keep his legacy alive. They traveled across the country, speaking at rallies, meeting with lawmakers, and advocating for policy changes. Their foundation, established in his honor, raised funds to support families affected by police violence. Through their efforts, they transformed grief into purpose, channeling their pain into meaningful work. "George wouldn't want us to stop," his sister Bridget said during an interview. "He'd want us to keep fighting." Internationally, the verdict resonated deeply. Leaders from countries like Canada, the UK, and South Africa issued statements praising the decision while acknowledging similar struggles within their own borders. Protests inspired by George Floyd's death continued worldwide, with demonstrators calling for accountability in their own nations. In Paris, activists demanded justice for Adama Traoré, a young black man who had died under suspicious circumstances after being detained by police. In Rio de Janeiro, crowds marched through the streets, chanting slogans against police brutality, targeting black Brazilians. Everywhere, people connected their fights to the larger global movement sparked by George Floyd's tragic death. Despite the progress made, challenges loomed large. Racism and inequality persisted, entrenched in institutions and attitudes that resisted change. Police killings of black individuals continued to occur, reigniting outrage and protests. The road ahead seemed daunting, but the determination of those committed to justice never wavered. For every setback, there was renewed resolve, a refusal to give up until fairness became the norm rather than the exception. In the months following the verdict, conversations shifted toward healing and rebuilding. Cities began implementing reforms. such as banning chokeholds and requiring body cameras for officers. Schools incorporated lessons about racial justice into their curriculums, teaching students about the importance of empathy and equality. Corporations pledged millions to initiatives aimed at closing racial gaps in education, healthcare, and employment. Though critics dismissed some of these measures as performative, others saw them as steps in the right direction. Yet amidst all the noise, one truth remained clear. George Floyd's death had changed the world. His name had become synonymous with courage and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, humanity could rise above. The verdict may have marked the end of Derek Chauvin's trial, but it was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one toward a future where no one else would have to endure what George did. As his family often said, justice for George is justice for all. And so, the fight continued, fueled by hope, love, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of a better tomorrow. The guilty verdict against Derek Chauvin sent shockwaves far beyond Minneapolis. It wasn't just a legal outcome, it was a turning point that resonated across continents, inspiring millions to re-examine their own societies and demand change. George Floyd's death had already ignited protests worldwide, but now, with accountability achieved in one of the most high-profile cases of police brutality, the movement gained even greater momentum. From Europe to Africa, Asia to Australia, people rallied behind the Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement, using it as a platform to address systemic racism and inequality in their own countries. In London, thousands gathered outside the U.S. Embassy, holding signs that read, "Justice for George Floyd," and "Black Lives Matter everywhere." The crowd spilled onto Westminster Bridge, blocking traffic as chants echoed through the city. Protesters knelt for 9 minutes, the same amount of time Chauvin had pressed his knee on George's neck, as a symbolic gesture of solidarity. Nearby, murals of George Floyd appeared on walls, painted by artists who wanted to immortalize his legacy. For many Britons, the protests also highlighted issues closer to home. Demonstrators drew attention to the deaths of individuals like Mark Dugan, a black man shot by police in 2011, whose case had sparked riots but never led to justice. The message was clear. Racism and police violence weren't unique to America. They were global problems requiring global solutions. In Paris, thousands marched through the streets carrying portraits of Adama Traoré, a young black man who died in police custody in 2016, under circumstances eerily similar to George Floyd's. His sister, Assa Traoré, became a prominent voice in France's fight against police brutality. She stood alongside BLM activists, urging people to recognize how deeply rooted discrimination was within French institutions. Protesters chanted, "No justice, no peace," while holding banners that read, "We are all George Floyd." Despite attempts by authorities to ban demonstrations, crowds defied restrictions determined to make their voices heard. The movement forced President Emmanuel Macron to confront uncomfortable truths about racism in France, though critics argued his response lacked substance. South Africa, a nation still grappling with the scars of apartheid, joined the chorus of outrage. In Johannesburg and Cape Town, protesters carried signs linking George Floyd's death to ongoing struggles against racial injustice at home. Many pointed out that poverty and police violence disproportionately affected black communities in South Africa, mirroring patterns seen in other parts of the world. Activists emphasized the need for economic empowerment alongside legal reforms, arguing that true equality required addressing both social and structural barriers. The protests reignited discussions about land redistribution, access to education, and fair treatment under the law. Australia saw its own wave of demonstrations drawing attention to the plight of Indigenous Australians. Thousands took to the streets in cities like Sydney and Melbourne, demanding justice for Aboriginal deaths in custody, a crisis that had claimed over 400 lives since the 1990s without a single conviction. Protesters held up photos of David Dungay Jr., an Indigenous man who died in prison after being restrained by guards, shouting, "I can't breathe," the same words George Floyd had uttered before his death. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Indigenous leaders used the moment to advocate for policy changes, including better health care, housing, and representation for their communities. While some politicians dismissed the protests as irrelevant to Australia's context, others acknowledged the urgent need for reform. Even in countries where racial dynamics differed, the impact of George Floyd's story was undeniable. In Brazil, where police killings of black citizens occur at alarming rates, activists organized marches in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. They highlighted the disproportionate use of lethal force in favelas, poor neighborhoods predominantly inhabited by Afro-Brazilians, and called for accountability. Similarly, in India, Dalit rights groups connected George Floyd's death to caste-based discrimination, pointing out how marginalized communities faced violence and oppression with little recourse. The global nature of the movement underscored a universal truth. No matter where you lived, systems of power often targeted the vulnerable, perpetuating cycles of injustice. Corporate giants and institutions also felt the ripple effects. In the wake of the verdict, companies around the world scrambled to demonstrate their commitment to diversity and inclusion. Nike, Adidas, and other major brands released campaigns featuring messages of unity and equality. Social media platforms temporarily banned hate speech and misinformation related to race, acknowledging their role in amplifying harmful narratives. Universities introduced courses on racial justice, while schools revised curriculums to include lessons about systemic racism. Though skeptics accused some organizations of performative activism, others welcomed these efforts as steps toward long-term cultural shifts. Governments began responding too, albeit unevenly. Some nations implemented tangible reforms. New Zealand passed legislation banning chokeholds and requiring independent investigations into police misconduct. Canada announced funding for community programs aimed at reducing crime and improving relations between law enforcement and minority groups. Elsewhere, however, progress stalled. In the United States, debates over policing reform grew contentious, with lawmakers divided on issues like qualified immunity and federal oversight. Critics argued that piecemeal measures wouldn't suffice. What was needed was a complete overhaul of how society viewed and interacted with marginalized populations. Artists played a crucial role in keeping the conversation alive. Musicians released tribute songs honoring George Floyd, blending grief with calls for action. Visual artists created murals not only in Minneapolis but in cities worldwide, transforming public spaces into memorials. Writers penned essays and poems exploring themes of loss, resilience, and hope. One particularly moving piece came from Amanda Gorman, the young poet who had captured hearts at President Joe Biden's inauguration. Her words reminded readers that while pain could be overwhelming, it could also fuel transformation. For George Floyd's family, seeing their loved one's name become synonymous with global change brought both pride and sorrow. They traveled internationally, speaking at events and meeting with leaders to share their vision for a more equitable future. Philonise Floyd addressed the United Nations Human Rights Council, calling for international standards to prevent police abuse. George didn't choose this path, he said, but we will honor him by ensuring no family suffers like ours again. Their advocacy inspired countless others to join the fight, proving that personal tragedy could spark collective action. Still, challenges remained immense. In many places, resistance to change ran deep. Police unions pushed back against reforms, framing them as attacks on officers rather than opportunities for improvement. Politicians hesitated to take bold stances, fearing backlash from voters. And despite widespread awareness of racial injustices, everyday acts of bias persisted, reminders that dismantling centuries-old systems would require patience and persistence. Yet, amidst the setbacks, there were glimmers of hope. Young people emerged as powerful forces for change, organizing rallies, creating content online, and educating peers about racism. Grassroots movements flourished, driven by ordinary individuals committed to making a difference. Technology played a key role, allowing activists to connect across borders and amplify their messages. What started as a local tragedy had evolved into a global awakening, an acknowledgement that humanity shared common struggles and aspirations. As months turned into years, George Floyd's legacy continued to inspire. His name appeared in speeches, books, and documentaries. Streets were renamed in his honor, and statues erected to commemorate his life. But perhaps his greatest contribution lay in the countless conversations he sparked. Conversations about race, power, and justice. People who had once been silent began speaking up. Communities that had felt powerless found strength in unity. Systems that had seemed immovable showed cracks, hinting at the possibility of something new. The verdict may have closed one chapter, but the story was far from over. Around the world, people carried forward the torch lit by George Floyd's memory, refusing to let his death fade into history. They understood that justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And though the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, they walked it together, guided by the belief that a better world was possible. After all, if one man's life could galvanize millions, then surely those millions could create lasting change. Years after George Floyd's death, his name remained etched in the hearts of millions. It was more than just a name. It was a symbol of resilience, courage, and the unyielding fight for justice. While Derek Chauvin sat behind bars, serving his 22-and-a-half-year sentence, the impact of George Floyd's life and death continued to ripple across generations and continents. His story had become a catalyst for change, sparking conversations that many had long avoided, and forcing societies to confront uncomfortable truths about racism, inequality, and accountability. In Minneapolis, where it all began, the intersection of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue, now known as George Floyd Square, remained a powerful tribute to his memory. The space was alive with murals, flowers, candles, and heartfelt messages left by visitors from around the world. People came not only to mourn but also to celebrate the man who had unknowingly sparked a global movement. Volunteers worked tirelessly to maintain the square, ensuring it stayed a place of reflection and solidarity. Every day, new faces appeared, young and old, black and white, rich and poor, all united by a shared desire for a better future. George Floyd's family played an essential role in keeping his legacy alive. Despite their grief, they channeled their pain into purpose, traveling the globe to advocate for racial justice and police reform. Philanice Floyd became a prominent voice, speaking at international forums like the United Nations and urging world leaders to address systemic racism. His speeches were filled with emotion, reminding audiences of the humanity behind the headlines. George wasn't perfect, he often said, but he didn't deserve to die like that. Their foundation, established in George's honor, raised funds to support families affected by police violence and provided scholarships for young people pursuing careers in social justice. Schools and universities embraced the opportunity to teach lessons inspired by George Floyd's story. Curriculums evolved to include discussions about systemic racism, civil rights movements, and the importance of empathy. Teachers encouraged students to think critically about privilege, bias, and how small actions could lead to big changes. In classrooms, children learned about figures like Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr., and now George Floyd, not just as historical icons but as real people whose lives mattered deeply. Murals of George Floyd adorned school walls, serving as constant reminders of the work still needed to achieve equality. Artists, musicians, and writers found inspiration in George Floyd's legacy. Songs dedicated to him climbed music charts, blending sorrow with hope and calls for action. Painters created vibrant murals in cities worldwide, transforming public spaces into galleries of remembrance. Writers penned essays, novels, and poems that explored themes of loss, resilience, and the power of collective action. One particularly poignant piece came from Amanda Gorman, whose stirring words reminded readers that even in darkness, there is light, and that light can guide us toward justice. The corporate world also underwent shifts, though progress varied widely. Some companies made genuine efforts to diversify leadership teams, invest in underserved communities, and promote inclusive practices. Others faced criticism for what activists called performative allyship, empty gestures designed to improve public image without addressing deeper issues. Still, The increased scrutiny pushed organizations to reevaluate their roles in perpetuating inequality. Social media platforms tightened policies on hate speech and misinformation, acknowledging their responsibility to foster safer online environments. Governments grappled with implementing meaningful reforms. In some countries, lawmakers passed legislation banning chokeholds, requiring body cameras and establishing independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct. Cities experimented with reallocating portions of police budgets to fund mental health services, education, and community programs. However, resistance persisted. Police unions argued that reforms endangered officers' safety, while politicians clashed over the scope and scale of necessary changes. Critics pointed out that piecemeal measures wouldn't suffice. True transformation required dismantling entrenched systems of oppression. Despite these challenges, grassroots movements thrived. Ordinary citizens organized rallies, workshops, and fundraisers aimed at fostering understanding and driving change. Young people, in particular, emerged as powerful voices, using social media to educate peers and mobilize support. Hashtags like Say Their Names and Justice for All gained traction, amplifying stories of others who had suffered similar fates. Technology allowed activists to connect across borders, creating networks of solidarity that transcended geography. What started as localized protests had grown into a global coalition united by a common goal: ending systemic racism. Yet the journey was far from easy. Racism and inequality remained deeply rooted, resisting quick fixes. Police killings of Black individuals continued to occur, reigniting outrage and protests. Families who had lost loved ones joined forces, sharing resources and strategies to demand accountability. Organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform gained momentum, fueled by communities unwilling to settle for half measures. Each victory, no matter how small, reinforced the belief that persistence paid off. For many, George Floyd's story served as both a mirror and a map, a reflection of society's flaws and a guide for navigating toward improvement. It highlighted the dangers of silence and complacency, showing how inaction perpetuated harm. Conversations once considered taboo became mainstream, encouraging people to examine their biases and privileges. Allies stepped forward, recognizing that fighting racism wasn't solely the burden of marginalized groups. It was everyone's responsibility. Even as time passed, anniversaries of George Floyd's death brought renewed attention to the issues he represented. Vigils and marches marked each milestone, honoring his memory while renewing commitments to the cause. Media outlets revisited his story, analyzing its impact and tracking ongoing efforts to dismantle systemic racism. Documentaries and books chronicled the events leading up to his death and the aftermath, ensuring that future generations understood why his name mattered. Ultimately, George Floyd's legacy was one of hope. His death had exposed deep wounds, but it had also revealed the strength of those willing to heal them. Communities came together, proving that unity could overcome division. Systems once thought immovable showed cracks, hinting at the possibility of something new. Though the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, the determination of those committed to justice never wavered. As people marched, protested, and advocated for change, they carried forward the torch lit by George Floyd's memory. They understood that justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and though the path might twist and turn, they walked it together, guided by the belief that a better world was possible. After all, if one man's life could galvanize millions, then surely those millions could create lasting change. George Floyd may have lost his life, but his spirit lived on, in the streets named after him, the laws rewritten because of him, and the countless hearts inspired by him. His story reminded the world that even in tragedy, there is potential for transformation.